Hi, my name is Scott Robertson. On this DVD, I'm going to share with you the techniques I like to use when doing industrial design renderings in Adobe Photoshop CS. You can do basically the things I'm going to show in the other older Photoshop versions as well, so don't worry if you don't have CS. There's really not much we're going to do in this DVD that requires it. So the way this DVD is going to start, we're going to start with a hand sketch of a bicycle, and then I'm going to sort of redraw that sketch in the computer using paths. Once we've made all of those paths, I'm going to fill those path shapes with different colors and values on separate layers. Once we have our layers organized, we're going to go in and selectively render our forms, and then we're going to follow that with one reflection layer over the top to give us the hint of a photoreal object. In the bonus section of this DVD, you're going to find an unflattened version of this bicycle. You're also going to find a couple other designs I put in, some more hand sketches. So please feel free to open that Photoshop rendering, pick through the layers, follow along, and then try to render your own versions. I hope you enjoy this very fun rendering technique.
All right, so here we have a bicycle. Well, not quite a bike yet, but my favorite way to do these sort of draft view renderings that we're going to get into is to always start with a line drawing first. And I like to generate those with traditional media. It's still my favorite way to generate the designs. I think the curves and shapes you draw with a hand-drawn line are in a lot of ways far superior to what you can do in the computer. It just seems to be much more sort of fluid and fast, and you get much more gestural designs. So what I've got here is a little Xerox copy of the hard points of a bicycle. So when I say hard points, I mean, where the rear wheel attaches, where the front wheel attaches. So I have the wheelbase. You can see there I just made the rear wheel larger. So there's a lot of flexibility. Even though I have some hard points, I feel free to move them around a little bit. But the wheelbase, you'll notice, stayed at the same place. Here's the bottom bracket where the crank arms of the pedals will attach. And I'm starting to sketch in some of the elements of the bike. The bike I'm going to do for this rendering DVD is going to be very much a movie-style bike. Probably not very efficient, not very light, but makes for a fun rendering, which is the focus of this DVD. But I also wanted to show you at the beginning of this DVD how I would generate some of these designs. So the first couple of minutes here, I'm going to draw real time, which is what I'm doing now, and then I'm going to accelerate the speed, and so at least you get to see everything happening before we jump into Photoshop. So I've got the head tube up here, so I have the pivot point for my handlebars. All those things, even though it's going to be a very strange-looking bike, all of the hard points are in the same place. So if you put the rider in the same position, meaning their hands, put the saddle in the same position, the pedals, the bicycle, if you were riding it, would feel just like a normal bicycle, meaning all the geometry is the same. So you can see it's all freehand process, and really just trying to find relationships of the curves. Lay in the down tube, the seat tube. These usually take between about 5 and 10 minutes each, I would say. Here I am, much, much faster. But it's the same process. Just more and more curves, trying to come up with some interesting intersections, watching the proportions. And I'll do maybe, if it's a real frame, I might do, 20 or 30 of these in a day, and then throw them all out on the conference table, and then pick my favorites to then go and do color renderings of. There's a rear fender going in there. So working out some of the early graphics, tightening up the wheel just a little bit. These are very, very loose. They're not meant to ever be shown to a client. They're really just sketches for myself to decide, is this the styling direction or the design direction that I want to go? And a lot of times I'll have multiple design directions sketched in. And a lot of times I'll cross out a line, and, since they're just sketches for yourself, there's no pressure on making it a beautiful looking drawing. You see there, just start with a big graceful curve. See if I can make that curve sort of work throughout the design. Another curve up to the head tube. And really at this point, I'm just trying to make big visual connections. It's really about graphic design at this point. You see there's no perspective involved. It's just draft view rendering, draft view sketching. It's quite simple, very straightforward. And it's really very large part of industrial design is about graphic design, especially when you take your products, your object, and put it into a draft view where there is no perspective. We don't have to worry about the depth of anything here. It's just graphic shapes, it's silhouettes, and how those shapes relate to each other. And later, it's going to turn into value breakups and trying to figure out how those values might relate to each other. And that'll get us into the rendering phase. So here again, I've got another quick little, sci-fi bike. Maybe for a movie, maybe just for fun. In this case, just for our fun rendering. It's got a little hub steering at the front. And I always get the question, well, how does that thing turn? Well, if you imagine, and if you'll, on the bonus section of this disc, I've included these sketches. And in one of those sketches, you'll actually see a top view of the fork. It's basically the shape of a baseball diamond. And if you imagine that the trailing edge of the fork is like the outfield, and the other part is like first base line and third base line, it's a big diamond shape in top view, and that would allow the wheel to turn inside that diamond. You can see these are all variations on the same sort of layout. They all have this sort of diamond-shaped fork, which I've just drawn there. They all have this sort of cantilevered saddle, cantilevered handlebars. Of course, they'd all be made out of, very advanced unobtainium. But we actually did a bunch of movie bikes like this for a project I was on, and built 3 of the designs and made them all out of hand-laid-up carbon fiber. And they were heavy, but they all worked. So it can be done. There's dropping in some more graphics. And a lot of times you'll hit on a little shape. And don't worry if your lines are going right over the top or a little bit obscured. You're going to fix that all a little bit later. You're just dropping in the front fork, just searching for a little graphic pattern. See, and I sort of established that on the rear fender. And now I'm carrying it up to the front. There's the arm that would hold it over to the hub. All right, here's one that I had done previously, and this is usually the next step before I get into doing a rendering in Photoshop. I like to do the visual or the value breakup, and I'm not worried about form yet. It's just purely silhouette. It's purely graphic design. It's now deciding what area of this bike or this design should be light and what area should be dark. So I'm doing really a material breakup or just a graphic breakup based on paint. So I've just got some Copic markers here. I'm going around, just markering in this ballpoint pen sketch. This is probably a copy of that original sketch. And then if it strikes me I don't like a little area, just go back in with a ballpoint pen, change some things before I marker it in. Again, this is just going to be the underlay for our Photoshop rendering. So I'm experimenting here, just searching, see if I can find some elements that I like. Not all this has to stay there when we go to Photoshop, but it's a good way to see the proportions in their sort of fatter, thicker volume. Here's the bike I'm actually going to do for this rendering. This is the marker sketch. Here's another marker sketch. This one is actually in the bonus section of this DVD. Again, the exact same process. Just markers, trying to see the graphic patterns. And here's another one. And these were all done for this DVD, trying to find a design that I liked enough to try to then take it into Photoshop. Actually, I like that rear fender a lot, and that could build in, and I'm not very happy with the midsection. Maybe if you do a rendering on top of that one, you can make it better. Okay, let's move into Photoshop. So it's basically the rendering I do in Photoshop is really a very simple strategy. It's really 2 layers, one base layer for the color paint. This is a bicycle helmet, obviously. And underneath here, you can see the base shapes that I've established. There's my color shell. And it's just matte surface, really right on top. Not much going on. And it's just been trimmed out by erasing out an edge to be a color shell. And you can see in these areas that I've started dropping in some reflections. And really all the reflections are just a reflection of a white light source directly above our shape. And you can play with the opacity of that shape, as I'm doing there, to change how shiny or how matte you would like that shape to look. Also, you can change the hue of the helmet underneath. So because my reflections reside on a layer above my color layer, it makes it very easy if your client comes along and says, oh, we don't like a red helmet, we want this dark purple helmet, right? Or this black helmet. And so everything's already there for you to fix that up. You'll see when I do go black, of course, it's black on a dark gray foam, so we lose the graphic. Here you can see it's a light helmet, and so that graphic of the vent shapes comes back. But it's very fun to experiment with those things when you're done with your rendering. Here's another helmet. Really, it's just tricking the eye into thinking that something is shiny. You see there's a bunch of grain that I've added to that lower section. That was just with a texturizer tool in Photoshop. There's my shiny layer on top. And I really only had to render the lower part. There's my color layer back on again. It's essentially a matte surface rendering. And there's my reflections. And if you look away and look back, your eye believes that it's very, very shiny. So that's really going to be the basis of this Photoshop rendering that I'm going to take you through. Here's a very real bicycle. All the components, these wheels, the handlebars, the saddle, they all came from a photograph of a real bicycle. And then everything that's red is here in this layer set. And that was all stuff that was rendered from scratch. And this was done the exact same process. I had done some ballpoint pen sketches, established the silhouette first, and then done my reflections. And there's my reflection layer. And then that area right there that I just pointed out, all I did was erase out some rough squiggles, actually, to get the reflection of the chainring. And here I'm able to change the frame color. All the reflections stay the same. It becomes a very efficient way to do photoreal industrial design presentation renderings. All right, let's get right into doing the Photoshop rendering from scratch. So what I've done is I've got my initial marker sketch that we've done earlier. I've put it on a separate layer. You can see now I have 2 layers there. And all I'm going to do is apply a value to the background, which I'm about to do. And I'm just going to paint bucket fill that background layer. There we go. The gray is there now. And now I'm going to switch that top layer to multiply. When you switch layers in Photoshop to multiply, everything that's white turns transparent, and you're only left with the value of that layer overlapping on the layer below. So here we've got a design on top, set to multiply, on top of our background. And this is a very, very easy way, especially if you have a nice clean line drawing, to allow you to paint underneath your line drawing and preserve the line quality on top. Now, the first step in this process, it's the easiest way I know how to render. And all I've done here so far is to open up the path window and selected a pen tool. And up at the top, I've selected the center button in the upper left for making it a path versus a vectored shape. And I'm going to basically, laboriously actually, go around carefully. Actually, it's not too careful at the beginning, but careful enough to retrace my line drawing. So you literally just click and drag these handles, and you can allow you to do these curves within Photoshop. So that's all I'm doing now, and it's kind of like redoing your drawing. And I'm thinking ahead to what layer might be on top of another layer. So you can see that that line that I just did with the pen tool went underneath on that dark gray part, and here in the saddle as well. It goes underneath the saddle. So I'm visualizing where I'm going to stack my layers later in the rendering. You never want to put your layer edges right up against each other because you get some weird artifacts right at the edges. So in this case, I'm thinking ahead, and I know I want to overlap my edges. So I make sure that whatever's on the bottom, whichever's on the top overlaps a little bit to each edge. So it means I can take a shortcut across on the bottom layers. You don't want to go all the way out to the edge. Like I've said, you just want to have it there so you get overlapping edges. Now I've sped this up a little because doing a Photoshop rendering is very interesting versus compared to traditional media. Traditional media, you'd spend a lot of time actually trying to get those gradations to be perfect, with marker or chalk or pencil or gouache. But when you jump to digital, where you spend your time is actually in making all of your layers and setting up these paths. And if you take the time to do this step right, the rendering of the actual form is incredibly fast. It takes actually no time at all, as you'll see. So this actually, it's a little bit mentally, it's a little challenging at the beginning to get your head around, but you really spend your time in different areas when you do a digital rendering versus traditional. Traditional is actually very fast in the initial block in, whereas Photoshop's very laborious in the initial block in. The best way I know how to do this and get really great crisp edges is with these paths. So once you get the hang of these, you can actually be pretty efficient. You won't put down too many curves or points that you don't really need. So you can see I'm, very loosely matching my line drawing. You could go slower and you could try to match it perfectly as you go, but you don't really need to. Okay, so I'm still only 2 layers in my initial rendering. Here's a circle coming in. So all I've done is, to make that path, is choose the shape tool from the left, have the path button selected in the upper left, and then start dropping in these circles by holding the shift key. I'm going to define the center of my circle, and then I'm going to snap these paths to that grid. So I've set up with a couple guidelines, my center, there's another circle. And I've taken that and I've selected all 3 of those, and I've copied and pasted, and I'm going to copy and paste that path to the rear wheel. And now I'm scaling it, and I've defined my center, and now I'm moving it and snapping it to that center line. So I've got some guides now for my wheelbase. There's a ground line. I'm snapping, making sure my wheels are both sitting at the same point on the ground. And now I'm going to drop in a spoke. So again, only doing one tool, the same thing over and over, just getting ready to make my layers. Okay, just took a larger portion of the rear wheel, did a little quick copy paste, and then just changed scale. And here now I'm fine tuning. So you drop in all your paths first, then you come back around and fine tune. In this case, since I have a repetitive shape, which is a spoke, I really only need to fine tune one of these shapes. So I'm trying to fine tune this spoke shape. And later on, I'm going to basically do a little copy, paste, and rotation to set up the other spokes. So it's very methodical, logical sort of, strategy in building these shapes. Not very creative, not very inspirational or gestural at all, but it's really important to fine tune your design. There again, I made another quick copy and paste of a circle, and I'm taking that down to become the disc brake for the front of the design. And here's the spoke going in. You can see in my line drawing is very efficient. If this is the spoke shape I want, I really only need to draw one of those. And here in the computer, I'll play with, do I want to do 3 of those spokes? Do I want to do 5? It's very easy to copy and paste and rotate those later. But as long as you have from your initial line drawing, at least one spoke drawn, then you have something to do your path over the top. Let's zoom in here. Again, now it's time to come back in and fine tune these. So you can see anywhere I need to fine tune, I can just grab a handle or a point. If I grab a point, I can move that point wherever I want. There we go, left and right. Or if I grab a handle, okay, I can stretch and distort that. So here I am, fine tuning. And this is actually the chance that you can take, and since you did a loose, pen sketch, this is your chance to refine that and improve your design. So I kind of like it. I sort of see it as the next opportunity that I have to evolve the styling of the object that I'm designing. So you can see I'm playing a little bit with there. What's the weight? What's the thickness? So maybe I want a little thinner through here, a little thicker. So just pull and stretch those guys around. So it's all on one path layer. You'll notice over to the left there. Okay, now you've just seen me add a new layer there, and what I'm going to start to do is set up my layers to render on. So what you do is this button to the lower left is the one that you fill. You're going to press that button to fill your layer. So I have a new layer in the upper right, and I'm starting to pick my color that I want to make that layer. So there's my color. Say OK, and then hit that button, lower left, and it will fill that path. So whatever path I had selected, it will fill, and it will send it to the layer that I have chosen in the upper right. So our next step, now that all the paths are refined, is to go in and start making separate layers for any color or any separate material throughout the entire object. So here I got a little bit of tweaking left to do. Not quite happy with those curves. So after I see that red shape that I've just dropped in there, I can actually see the edge a little bit better. So now before I drop in the next layer, I want to go back in and fine tune that a little bit. And it's really a very sort of systematic, very, very simple approach. It just starts with paths, and then it goes into making layers. So hit the button there, made another layer. And I'm going to pick a different color and a different value. So let's go up here. I have my destination layer. There's the fill button again. And now I've got 2 layers. And you see there's a little funkiness right down there. There's a little edge showing. You can either come back and erase that or try to clean it up in your paths. And if you clean it up in your path, you just refill it. You can freehand erase it probably just as easy. Okay, so let's fine tune a few more paths before we fill. So again, just grabbing the points, grabbing the handles, stretching them around, right? Making sure that those layers overlap, right? So on the lower edge of that path, I've gone underneath the red part, but I haven't gone so far that when we fill this layer, it's going to cover that sort of grayish layer, our second layer we added. Same with the saddle. I don't want it to poke up above the top of the saddle, but I want it to go up above the lower edge of the saddle. Add a new layer and fill. So you can see up there, see the top of that layer, right, is just underneath the saddle, but not all the way to the top edge. And here's my saddle layer and fill it. So it's the same steps over and over. So fine tune the path. When the path is selected, it will fill. So I unselect it, reselect it, a new layer on top, and get ready to fill this one. And a little bit of tweaking here. And change the layer order there so that the handlebars, the top part is in the correct position so that we can see it. Come down here, do a little changing around on the fork. You can see it doesn't actually take that much time. The rendering I'm doing for you here took me about 5 hours to do from scratch, from where we're starting here with just a line drawing, a little quick marker sketch, to the finished level. So, you can imagine you could pretty easily sketch out a bunch of those sort of draft view line drawings with ballpoint pen and marker, and then in the afternoon, pick your favorite, and by the end of the day, have a photoreal rendering. One of the things that makes this rendering process so easy is the environment that I'm rendering in. The environment is this indoor lighting scenario where I've sort of created a fake photo stage, and I'm using very soft light from above. We'll talk more about that as we start rendering the forms. But it makes rendering it very simple because, I don't have to worry about blue sky or being in an outdoor environment. There's nothing else really to reflect into the shape. So it makes doing shiny objects pretty simple, mostly like doing a matte surface rendering first and then adding a little quickie reflection over the top. But we're not quite there yet. At this point, it's still more and more path finessing, setting up a couple of concentric circles on my wheel center. So now I have a perfect circle there. Making the path drop just underneath it, so it's just inside that circle. Later on, those two will be combined to making one layer. There's a new layer. Let's pick the path and fill it. So there's that new area filled. So you can see we're starting to graphically see our object come to life a little bit. Let's define the center for the bottom bracket. There's another circle path thrown on there. I'm going to pull this path just inside that. So there's the fork path. Now let's do a little outside. We'll include that disc on the inside. It takes a little bit longer to make that a radius, but you can still, hand pull those things to make them a radius. All right, so not really happy with that path right there. Basically going to redo that one a little bit. Visually, as I pulled back from it, they weren't connecting, so here I'm doing a large path over the top just as a guideline. So put that over the top. I like that guideline. I'm going to pull this guy over to that new guideline. So you can see now I'm really taking advantage of the digital tools, whereas, you can't do this in a traditional sketch or traditional rendering. All right, if you'd already blocked that in with marker, I guess you can always go fatter with marker, but if I'd already rendered it with some colored pencil and things, it would be very difficult for me to do. So I've just deleted that, I've reselected that area, and I've refilled it. Okay, now I like that a little bit better. Now it visually connects a little bit better with the seat tube. Again, selected that bottom bracket disc, filled that layer. You can see I'm really one path layer, and on the right-hand side, more and more layers are being made. Now, you could try to consolidate a little bit. And the way I like to consolidate my layers is if two areas are not touching each other, meaning they're easy to select later with like a lasso tool, then, I can put them on the same layer because I can always grab them easily. If they're touching each other, say like that cream-colored area or the gray area versus the red, I wouldn't want to put those on the same layer because they'd be very hard to grab because they're touching. But for instance, this fender up here doesn't touch the lower little triangle guy below or that bottom bracket disc. I could put those on the same layer. In the case of this DVD, I'm actually doing a lot of layers because I want the ability to change colors on all those later. And just for simplicity and freedom. And if you have the computing power and a fast enough computer, the layers do afford you some freedom. You can see I'm actually working pretty fast on this rendering, and that's why I'm actually not going back and naming things. And I use the selection tool, that 4-arrow tool, and I just turn on bounding box up above later to help me find some of my layers. I actually include this unflattened Photoshop rendering on this DVD, so you can throw it into Photoshop, look at all these layers. I did go back and rename them all, so it'd be a lot easier for you to find your way around. So here, let's just finesse the fork a little bit. The fender. So trying to get those graphic shapes to work together. Here's the little black area underneath the fender. And pick my destination layer and hit the fill button. And you can see the layer order is not quite right. Change the layer order. There we go. Now the fender is inside that baseball diamond shaped front fork. Make a new layer. Let's pick this area here. A little quick copy paste. Copy paste. Let's change the size of that circle. And now I'm getting ready to, the reason I needed that extra circle, I needed to do a little overlap. So my wheel and my tire, the wheel overlaps the tire. See, there we go. Now, if you pick those and you hold the shift key, we'll do it again here, pick two separate paths. Holding the shift key, you can have it fill between those two paths. So I've got to zoom in order to grab that. There we go, the inside and the outside. And by experimenting with the combine button up above, you can see I have it selected all the way over to the right button, and it allows me to fill between those two lines. And again, these aren't even the final colors of my bike. It doesn't matter when you're making your layers. So there we've made the one of the spokes. And filling in that rear disc. Double checking my layer order. Here I'm locked a couple layers together so that I can move them together. Now I've selected that and I've changed rotate. And what you do before you rotate this, pull your center over and put it on the rotational center of your wheel. And I'm going to do 3 spokes. So I'm going to want to make this rotate 120 degrees, 1/3 of 360. So there it's rotated. And now apply that rotation and move it just a little bit. You know, some of my centers I think are not perfectly on center. In doing a faster rendering, you're not doing a draft. It's a draft view, but you know, things can be pretty loose actually and still look photoreal. It's really to get the idea across of the design. There we've rotated the third spoke. And now we have our wheel. You know, there are other programs, obviously, that are better to do drafting in. You know, you could, I think, even in Illustrator works much better as a drafting program for doing this sort of repetitive shapes and then doing an array and setting up those angles. But I found that I can get away with it in Photoshop pretty effectively. So here I'm going to take all three spokes and I'm going to group them. I'm going to link them, and then I'm going to merge linked. So there's merge linked again. So now I've grouped those guys. So consolidating the layers a little bit, making it a little bit easier for me to deal with. Now, I've relocated my center, and if you want to play with the composition of where you have your wheel, go ahead and I've locked those little black triangle guys and my gray spokes together, and now I'm rotating all three of them together. But it was very important that I put my center of rotation onto my wheel center. So once I find the location I like compositionally, then I'll go ahead and accept that by hitting return and move on to the front wheel. So fill my path and duplicate that layer, move the center of rotation. Oops, not quite on the right center. Let's try that again. Let's put it here. Center of rotation. There we go. Looks a little better. Let's duplicate it again. And let's go again, negative 120. So again, a three spoke at the front. Group them all. I guess link them all. Merge linked, and then do your rotation. I like to make those different than the rear one, meaning the rotation angle, because just so it's not so static. And you can see I've got a little overlap. I'm ready for my hub to overlap onto those spokes. There we go. I've made two of those guys. I'm going to come in here and start to fill, there we go, the remainder of that wheel. And lock those guys together. Check the position. Fine tune it a little bit. Okay, we've got a couple little rough edges there, so I'm just going to quickly go ahead and grab a brush, a little hard edge brush. There we go. I'm just going to fine tune that. I'm going to erase it a little bit. So you can see I'm not afraid to go back in. I'm not so locked into using those paths that I won't go in and just by hand go in and fine tune a few things. All right, we're going to drop in the bottom bracket here and the crank arm. So again, a little quick copy paste, snap it to the guides. Let's take another disc, copy paste. This will be the end of the crank arm where the pedal goes. And let's put in the crank arm. And see, this wasn't even in my drawing, so you can easily do this stuff Photoshop only, or you can just overlay on top of your initial sketch. It's really fun. I mean, it's such a fun way to make objects. And there's the crank arm and the spindle, and the pedal is just, of course, it's, you know, sci-fi bike, so the pedal's just a spindle. Okay, let's get rid of the paths there. We don't really need to see those much. We've got all of our layers. We turn off the sketch below. And now we're going to work on the background. So in order to get this sort of faux photo stage feel, I'm going to drop in a gradation. So there we are, a top to bottom gradation. Just dark at the top, light at the bottom. And I'm going to take a big airbrush. Oops, let's pick the right light. And I'm going to block out a ground plane. So I'm hinting at a little bit of perspective here. And now I put a layer on top of that background, quickly blocking in a little ground shadow, just holding the shift key and did that straight line across. So erasing it a little bit here. It's a little too strong. Taking a lot of artistic license with my cast shadow, and then squeezing it. So all I did there was grab it with the move tool, had the bounding box turned on so I could just squash it. And now I'm making sure that my tires have a little flat on them so they sit right down and attach right to the ground. Let's come in and darken up the shadow right next to the tire. You don't want this object floating. So there we go. And that very, very thin cast shadow hints, at a sort of fuzzy overhead light. It also hints at a bit of a ground plane, which is sort of cheating this draft view into having a little bit of perspective. And now I'm going to go in and start to work out some of the colors. So I just lightened up that crank arm so we could see it. What I have my selected layer. And here's an airbrush. So I have a big soft airbrush. I've also included my brushes on this DVD, which there are not many. Just some very basic tools. And now I'm starting to add form. So the key to adding form in this rendering technique is that, notice the highlighted layer there. It's blue off to the right. You see a little lock on it. Well, that's a preserve transparency button that I hit just above. You see at the top of the layer menu, the little darkened box to the left. The first box there is the preserve transparency button. What that allows you to do is only apply value where you already have pixels. So I use this over and over and over again. It's the simplest way I know to preserve all the edges that we created with our paths. So I spent all that time creating a nice, tight, clean edge, and now reorganize my layers there a little so they overlap the right way. But all I had to do was hit preserve transparency. I added a little bit of value, and now I'm going to colorize that layer. So it was just grayscale, or grays. So you open up your hue saturation window, hit colorize, and start sliding around the hue button, or slider, and the saturation until you get a color that you like. So you could effectively add all your value first, showing all your form, and then colorize it after the fact. We'll do a little bit of that, and we'll do a little bit of straight color rendering from the beginning. So here I'm just double checking my layer order. Going to consolidate a little bit. I've now put the front and rear wheel on the same layer. I'm going to change their value by going into the levels window. So I just went into the levels window and darkened the entire layer. Here I am back in hue and saturation now. So you can see it really doesn't matter that I blocked in, some random colors for the start of the rendering. Because here I can just go back in and slide around the hues and saturations until I get something that I like. Now, if you hold down the Option key when you go to a new layer, so if you hold down Option and go Command U, that gets you into the hue and saturation menu. It will set the same parameter for the color shift that you just did. So, for instance, when I did that dark sort of orangish color and I wanted it at the rear of the bike, I just held down Option Command U. And it gets you the same color setting. So you don't have to write down those numbers and try to remember how you slid around these little buttons. So I'm experimenting and just trying to figure out what I want to do with color. And you can see I find my way around by hitting that, just selecting the area I want, and it automatically goes to the layer I want. Sort of allows me to get away from having to name everything. I'll get a little more saturation into this main frame color. Okay. There we go. I like that color a little bit better. It's another way you can do it. You can just paint them right on. So again, I hit preserve transparency. You see the little locks starting to show up, little padlocks showing up on the right-hand part of each layer. There we go. I just hit preserve transparency again. And let's pick that guy, preserve transparency. Now I'm going to darken down that one. So it's really important that you work out your graphics before you start doing your rendering. So I'm still working color, trying to get the graphics where I want them, meaning the product graphics, right? What's the color and value of certain areas of the object? Here I'm tweaking the color of the fenders, going from green to blue. All right, almost ready to start rendering some form. But you can see the bulk of my work is really not so much in rendering form at all. It's really about making layers with the use of paths. Now getting the color graphics to work. Experimenting, maybe go a little monochromatic through this fork and mainframe area. See, and if I hit the preserve transparency button, I can just paint right on top and I don't lose my edge. Okay, getting down to the last few areas, starting to feel okay about the color palette and the values of my bike. But I really try to set this before I start rendering a lot of form. Gives you a good preview, of what the thing's going to look like. I think I'm going to add a little stripe on the tire here. So I just added another path there, little copy paste. And now what we're going to do, add a little stripe on the tire. So I have a new destination layer. And all I had to do there was, you saw me just click the second button from the left in my path menu. Let's do the same at the front. Quick copy paste. And if you pick an airbrush, set the size of the airbrush, and then hit the second button in that path menu window, it will stroke that path that you have selected with the last tool you had. So I had chosen an airbrush, set the size, and stroke that path to get those little stripes. Okay, here I've brought in a couple of elements from a previous bicycle rendering I did in the interest of adding a little bit of detail to this rendering. A lot of times, if you're rendering lots of different designs, sort of variations on designs, a lot of those parts will be the same. So in this case, this is a part that might remain the same for maybe 10 bike renderings, like that earlier red production bicycle that I showed you at the beginning of the disc. So a lot of times you have a library of these parts, and they're all lit with this same, simple overhead lighting. And that's a disc brake caliper I just brought in there. And it's just made up of a bunch of, basically a bunch of circles, add a little bit of form, a little bit of shading, but it's really nothing very special at all. And I'm scaling it. I'm going to move it around. And I'm just going to make this one work for this rendering. So this would be the case if you're doing, say you're doing a camera or something, you might have some lens centers that might remain the same, and you can pull those in. Some of the buttons might even be constant, or maybe they're shapes and things that you're forced to work with as a designer, and so you might have those already previously rendered. All right, so just made a little path there for my disc and made a new layer and filled it. Again, nothing new. Really only done a couple of things so far as Photoshop techniques go. And now I'm just actually free sketching in some connections from my disc brake over to the internal part of the hub, right? Because that disc has to be attached, right, to the hub. There we go. Not to the inside, sorry, but the outer ring. So it's actually attached to our wheel. Our caliper's got to go over and attach to the inside of the hub. And again, there's no paths for those. Those are just freehand sketching with a flat, round airbrush. Dropped in some fasteners, and I'm going to erase out that little part there. So it does attach only to the outside ring. There we go. A couple little adjustments to size. There's my caliper. Now the caliper needs to attach to the inside. So caliper's going around. I'm just adding in, and in this case, just freehand painting in a new silhouette shape for our pivot on that internal hub there. And there's the pivot itself. And again, in the scale of this rendering, right, it's when we zoom way back out, this just needs to have enough convincing technology, or things going on in there that it looks about right. It looks convincing enough. Just resetting my pivot there, just move that little pivot up a little bit. Let's move that location. That's going to be the little arm that comes out of my fork to make our front wheel turn. That could either be, it could be a little hydraulic arm that sort of pushes and pulls, or it could be a looping cable that is a pull-pull system. Here I'm putting a couple of perforations in my disc brake. Then again, this is just a flat eraser in this case, set to 100% opacity. And I'm just clicking along. So, it didn't take long to do that layout. It was all eyeball. But it will be convincing enough, and for the purposes of an early rendering of a first idea, it'll be convincing enough. So I brought in a couple little grips with some brake levers on them, and I'm going to position them, change the layer order so that they go on top of my handlebars. There we go. So we got a near side grip, the right-hand grip, and there's the left-hand grip. See, I'm showing a little bit of perspective. On a bicycle, it's very easy to do one of these side view drafts because there's almost no depth, left to right. So, if you just show a little bit of perspective on those grips, technically, of course, you'd see the other side of that front fork. But in this case, in the interest of doing it quicker, especially for your first ideas, you can get away with cheating a little bit of quick perspective on there. Here's the rear bearing going in. So I've located it on my guidelines, snapped it to center. And just going to duplicate my disc brake, bring it to the rear, scaling it down, locating it on center. And you can see I had a couple of holes there that weren't erased because it was behind the fork at the front. So if you just rotate it, you can hide those behind the stay at the back as well. And now I've got to attach this to the wheel somehow. So here I'm going to put a few just quickly hand-drawn attachment points to my spoke. And let's take this caliper, it's a partial caliper, throw it on top of that disc brake and underneath the stay. There we go. Scale it down. Move it around so it overlap our disc just enough. There we go. And that's convincing enough for a brake caliper. Duplicate another layer path. Make sure it's on center. There we go. And yet another one. There we go. The disc was just a little bit too thin, so just made it a little bit fatter, and I'm going to erase the third hole. Again, just eyeballed it. Again, look, when we zoom out, you can hardly see them, but you need those little details there. Your eye will see it, but it won't really check to see if they're, exactly aligned. You see it's starting to come to life a little. And I'm going to drop in some cables. Again, now I'm back to paths. Anytime you want to have a perfect edge, the best way to do it is with a path. And I'm going to fine tune those cable routing lines a little bit. So there we go. So that's for our cable housing. So once you have the curve where you like it, you can stroke that path with an airbrush or a regular brush, whichever brush you like. There we go. There's a cable coming out for our brake, coming out of the fork. Getting that curve the way I want it. I'm going to save the file. It's time accelerated, so it's going a little quick. You can't really see me saving a lot, but I do save quite a bit. All right, now we're going to talk about making your own brush. So getting ready to do the tire texture. So what you do is, in this case, I just opened up a quick file. You have a white background, and you really just design a shape that you want. So in this case, I want to put a tire texture, sort of a tread texture onto my tires. So here I'm just sketching the tread, as I think that may be the repeating tread shape that I want. Zoom in a little. And just paint it in black and white. And this would be the case if you're going to make any custom brush would be made this way. So you start on a white background, paint with value, right? So just working with blacks and grays. Here I'm just fine-tuning the shape a little. And then you go to the marquee tool, selection tool, select a box around it, a square, go to edit, and go to define brush. And there's the define brush. That's the name. You can name it there if you like. And we've made the brush, and now we're going to use it in just a moment. But first we have to set some parameters for it. So here it'll show up in my brush palette. And now what I want to do is I want to go over to these variants on the left, and I want to change spacing. And by changing the spacing, I can make that tread pattern repeat with a gap in between. It's a way for me to sort of cheat in Photoshop and make it repeat. Here I'm going to set it to direction, and then it's going to follow my stroke. And then I'm going to turn off that spacing there, the scatter or the size change. And now you can see my tread follows my path. And now by saving it again in my brush palette, I'm able to retain those attributes of that brush. And then I delete the original. So let's try it. Let's give it a try here. So we have the brush selected. We can see it spacing down below. Let's hide the brush palette. Let's get ready to paint on a layer. Let's delete that one. Just down to our one layer. There's our new paint layer. Switch this to black so we can see it. And now hold down the Shift key. And I'm just going to paint a straight line right across. There you go. That's my tread. Now what I'm going to do is go here, a little quick copy and paste on another path. And you can see actually a little bit of gray tread there. I was experimenting in this rendering before I decided on this brush. And what I'm going to do is size that brush with the bracket keys. Bracket keys, if you don't know, make your brushes in Photoshop smaller and larger. And there we go. I just hit the button in my path window to make it stroke that path. So I stroke that path with that tread pattern. There's my tread pattern. And I'm going to do another one of those. Again, make sure I have the right brush selected. Hit the stroke path button. I've just copied that tread layer, and now I'm going to size it a little bit larger. There we go, sizing my next path. It's really fun, you can do this. Imagine you do a stitching on something, right? You could make one single stitch. Just size my brush. I squashed it a little bit. My tread is wrapping out on my round section of my tire, so it should be getting a little bit thinner as it wraps around towards the center. There we go. I just did stroke that path for a second time, a slightly larger path. Wasn't quite large enough. I'm going to try that again. There we go. Getting closer. You can see it a little bit better at the bottom. Looks like my path might be a little bit off center. Again, it's straight draft view rendering. It's the simplest, industrial design type of rendering I know how to do. Gets me to the sort of finished photoreal level faster than anything else. And it has so many things. Rendering in Photoshop, it has so much stuff that I can do that I can't do with traditional media. Or you could maybe pull it off with traditional media, but you'll never get the amount of time professionally to do it. So you need to be able to do these things very fast. So here I've just grabbed my tread on a separate layer. I've just copied that layer, and I'm pulling it up to the front wheel. As opposed to making a new path and restroking that path, I've decided that I can just scale down my tread and basically pull it right up to the front. Here's the other one. Let's bring that guy in, scale it. Now when I'm scaling here, I'm holding the Shift key so that I don't make it an ellipse. It stays a perfect circle. Scale it just outside that tire stripe. So doing some fine tuning for positioning. There we go, a little rotation. Generally pretty happy with it. So you can see, to this point, I've only rendered a little bit of form, which is just on the fenders. But really, it's just making paths, making layers. And unfortunately, it's a bit tedious, but sort of no way around it. But this is really where 70% of your rendering time is spent, is actually building these paths and building the layers. It's very different than doing a traditional media rendering. But if you do it this way, and you have all these layers set up, it makes it very, very easy to go back and change color. It makes it very easy to do design changes. And now we're basically ready to start our form definition. So I've got a basic airbrush. I usually like to paint at about 50% opacity. You see I hit Preserve Transparency button again. And I'm picking up the gray from the ground below, reflecting it up into the bottom of the tire a little bit. And our lighting scenario for this rendering is going to be a very simple overhead light scenario. or light source. Here's a little cast shadow. The section is kind of circular, right? So we've got a little bit of a tire flare sticking out here into the light, and then up at top, of course, it returns under. A little cast shadow from our fender. See, by hitting preserve transparency, now when I paint my tire stripe, I'm only painting where I already have pixels. So darkening it down. A little hint of a cast shadow from our fork and our hub, our disc brake just above. So getting back to my light source here, it's just a very simple overhead light box. Much like you could set up on any product design or product photo shoot. Very, very simple. And so it gives me very soft cast shadows, as we can see from the ground plane shadow and we can see from the fork shadow. And what that does, it just makes my drawing or my rendering faster and more efficient, because I don't have to go spend a lot of time doing exact cast shadow plotting. If you're doing something more illustrative, then by all means, you'd probably go in and do some really defined cast shadows. And I'll show you one of those at the very end. But at this point, in trying to keep it efficient and just delineating my design intent in the proper color and material, the soft overhead light is a great way to go. So here I've decided I wasn't really happy with my my spoke colors. So go ahead and just pop up that hue and saturation window, change the colors, custom color picker, dropping in a little bit of light value. And working around the rim of the front wheel, darkening a little bit because the fender's above. In this case, it's a very graphic rendering. It's quite. There's not actually a lot of form. There is a lot of form, but with our simple lighting scenario, there's not a huge amount of transition that we have to worry about rendering. And I did that on purpose. You try to set up your lighting for doing these production style renderings in such a way that allows you to not have to do a huge amount of shadow casting. Effectively, what I'm trying to imagine here is that my light source is directly above the bike, but also a little bit towards us, meaning it's pulled out a little bit away from the center line of the bike, which allows me to get a little bit of light in on the top surfaces of those spokes. Even though the light's generally above, and the rim is definitely, it's a planar wheel, right? So the rim would be directly above the spoke. We can go ahead and cheat it a little bit by pulling the light a little towards us and getting a little bit of light on top of those spokes to show the form. Your brain interprets form with value change. So if you just keep in the back of your mind that if there's a form change, you need to make a value change. If you do that, whenever somebody looks at it, it's going to look like it has form, even if you get it in the wrong direction. So that's something I say to my students over and over, is that form change equals value change, and vice versa. So here we are going in doing a little bit of detail rendering. I'm not going to really go in and tighten up this hub and the mechanism in there much tighter than what I already have here. I'm going to put a little bit of time in on this disc. Need to recenter it a little bit. I've hit preserve transparency. There we go. I've actually made a copy of that and made it slightly larger. That allowed me to put a little beveled edge at the outside of that disc. All right, let's go up here. I've got a sort of interesting, sort of a comb brush that I made, a bunch of thin lines. And I'm going to sort of rake that across this thing to try and get the feel that we've got some scratches and, it's not a perfect painted surface. It's not painted at all. It's alloy, right? So it's a metal disc. So I'm just sort of scratching across this thing with a big sort of rake brush that I made. I believe I've also included that brush on this DVD. So raking across, you can't see much happening. It's very subtle, but it is making a little bit of a difference. A bit more texture. Okay, and I'm actually burning some of those highlights a little bit darker. There we go. I'm going to dodge those areas. And when you dodge and burn as a different way of introducing value, you have to keep in mind that it is dodging and burning to white and black, not to a color. Here I'm going to increase the contrast, trying to make it look even more metallic. But it's a pretty effective way to retain the texture that you've introduced. If I just went and painted over that with white and black, of course I would lose my texture. So dodging and burning is a good way to get those sort of harsh metallic looks. Okay, going in here, decided I need to lighten up the top of the tire a little bit. It's not really reading enough for me when I zoom back. So you see me, I'll start now at this point zooming in and out quite a bit, trying to zoom back to see if I have enough contrast. In that case, I decided I didn't, so I need to zoom back in. So zoom back out. Yeah, I can now see that from a distance a little bit. Let's go back. Let's revisit our tire stripe a little. Looked like in the shadow area it could get a little bit darker. Again, this, if you're rendering it at this level, getting ready to hit Photoshop, you really need to have a good understanding of the foundation skills, the matte surface basics of highlight, reflected light, coarse shadow, cast shadow. This DVD is assuming that you have got some good basic skills in those areas before you hit the digital. And you're sort of reapplying what your knowledge is already with traditional media into the digital realm. There we are, adding shape to that tire. Again, just a simple overhead light source. Let's work on the stripe a little bit. Stripe, of course, is very dark through here because it's underneath that rear stay and underneath the fender. Turns under a little there. Maybe could catch a little bit of light on the lower portion. And picking the same color for the highlight area and just quickly blocking in with a big soft airbrush. You can see my strategy for rendering these shapes is usually start sort of inside out. In this case, I'm sort of starting at the top. The middle is sort of already the right value. There's the reflected light from the ground plane. So anytime I need that color, I just go down and I grab it right off of the floor, come back up, paint it right onto my shape. Dropping this part into shadow. What I was starting to say, though, was about the foundation skills and matte surface rendering. That will be followed up or explained in a couple other DVDs, hopefully pretty soon. But I love doing this sort of rendering so much, and I've had a lot of requests for this one, so this guy's coming first. Here we are, adding a little highlight edge to that rim. Save your file. Hadn't saved it in a while. Okay, see I've zoomed back now, starting looking at it. It's all the time taking on a little bit more realism. Things are starting to take on a little bit of form. It's time we go in and deal with this big, light ring. So I've merged those two guys, but made them the single layer now for the disc. Now I'm ready to go in and paint it. Preserve transparency turned on. And add the scratches. So a little bit of quick texture. A little bit more. There we go. Add a little bit more value. So I'm adding a couple of white scratches. Painting in a few little highlights. A little cast shadow edge maybe. Put a little bevel on that. Again, you could get very carried away with this and spend, days and days on this rendering. But, it's very much supposed to be a rapid industrial design, production rendering that, you maybe spend, half a day on. And the idea would be, when I do a normal design job like this is to have, a dozen of these done at the end of a week. There we go. That looks a little bit better. And let's adjust the contrast a little bit, make it look a little more metallic. There we are. I'm sliding these. See this? I'm in the levels window there, and I'm sliding those buttons independently for shadow value, middle range value, and highlight value. It's a very effective way to change the contrast of a certain layer. All right, go back to the airbrush. Let's go to our main body here, the largest part of surface area. And it's just starting to render in. It's pretty straightforward. Hit preserve transparency, light from above. The handlebars obscure the light for the head tube part of this, but there's that little tongue out there, so that catches a little bit of light. Here I want to make that have a little bit of form, so all you have to do is add value. Okay, and you can see it now immediately this guy's going to start to have some form, so I want that guy to wrap around the back. The stay is on the same. We're going to make a little continuous surface here, go right through around that bottom bracket and then into the back of the bike. There we are, picking up the ground color, adding a little flare around that bottom bracket. Now you can see just because I have a silhouette that says one shape, right, doesn't mean you can't come back inside that shape and add a lot more form. And that's really a fun thing to do with this sort of design rendering. See, I'm coming back in, I'm actually adding a lot more form, right, onto the inside of the shape. Really, the silhouette is identical, but, that is a shape that didn't show up in my marker sketch, didn't really show up when I was doing my silhouette because it was draft view, yet you can add a lot of that form now. It's sort of flattish right through there. So if it's flat, make the gradation flat, meaning no gradation. Let's switch to the upper part of the tube now. Again, light from above. Trying to render that like it's continuous. Here's where my handlebars, they sort of come back to a point. It's kind of a V shape in top view. So it's overlapping the tube, going back to the orange one a little. Sort of working those two together. Here we are, back to our seat tube. Let's put a little core shadow right through there. Go down and get the ground color. Pull that up into the bottom of the seat tube. So here again, adding a little bit of form. I know the saddle's a little bit wider than the seat tube, so it must be flat through a little portion there. And grabbing a little bit of the light off the top of the tube. And zoom in a little. There we go, a little shadow side to that. That's maybe where my radius is as it turns under. The seat's very integrated to the seat tube, or the saddle's integrated to the seat tube. Save the file. Again, hit preserve transparency, grab my airbrush. On the DVD as well, you'll find those tool presets that I've got over on the left. You'll also find those on this disc. So if you see me grabbing a tool over and over, those are all the presets I have. There's not many. You can be painting with the same one as you learn how to do this. Like I said, it's not a very, it's not very artistic. It's really hardcore industrial design. It's just what's the true color of the material, and trying to show the forms that you've designed. So you need to obviously know the sections of the object you're designing first and foremost. Otherwise, you're not going to have much success trying to paint those, trying to render those sections. So here I have a little seam. That's like a little two-piece handlebar. There's a little blue cap on it. So I'm rendering the little radius. Picked up some ground color, bringing it in. A little too much, so don't feel like you have to stay with that. You can just come back in and grab colors that are around it to darken it up. You can see all the time starting to get more and more form, starting to look more three-dimensional. Again, if at any time your object's looking too flat, add a gradation. Of course, it always works best if you pay attention where the light source is coming from. I know the light's coming from up above, so added a little bit of light across the top surface, trying to describe the form. So there's our saddle. Yeah, see, playing around with it, changing the form a little bit. Here's the cap of the handlebars. Adding a little edge to it, so a little radius. There we go, a little highlight right at that radius. Going to zoom in, of course, when it gets to be a small little area. Save your file. All right, let's take this middle piece. I'm going to continue the form that I established from the two orange pieces through here. Introduce reflected light from below. Introduce a little more reflected light. Actually, that's a lot of reflected light, but you see effectively making that part of the form on center there of our chainstay stick out further than the lower part. So it tells you that stay is a little bit wider. And in draft view, of course, I have no perspective here. I really don't even have a cast shadow down below. So really the only thing I can use is that reflected light from below and the light source from above to try and make that surface come towards us. Basically making it bump out of the surface of the, actually in this case, out of the surface of the monitor. It used to be out of the surface of the paper, but now we have our digital paper. So there we go. That one's pretty done. Those guys are on the same layer. I just isolated that guy so I can put him on a separate layer. There we go. Again, a little reflected light from below. In this case, I'm using gray, and I'm using gray for a reason. And you're going to see that in a couple minutes. I have gray ground because then if I want to change the frame color, that gray reflected light won't change. We'll see me get into that in a bit. Here's the front fork taking shape. And it's supposed to be a darker orange. Same sort of similar hue to that main down tube, but a little bit darker. So add it. See, don't be afraid to add in a bunch of reflected light. If you go too far, just grab the dark orange and come back and redefine those surfaces. It's obviously too much. Come back, knock it down a little bit. Sort of a triangular shaped section through there. Sort of a little flattish area on top catching some light. And then as it rolls under, catches a little more reflected light. There we go. That's actually a little reflected light coming off of that fork surface. Add a little radius there. Those are actually two separate pieces that mate together there right around the bottom bracket area. And this rendering, once you get the hang of it, is a lot of fun because these become really fast. And like I said, they're mostly about doing graphics. And here's some graphics. I'm going to pull our Design Studio Press logo in here. I'm going to colorize it. I'm going to throw it on this bike. Here we go, sizing the logo. A lot of products really don't, I won't say they don't come to life, but they don't look very real until you, of course, get the corporate logo or the model name on it, because it's rare nowadays we can ever find a product without that on it. So it's only appropriate that I put one on here. So positioning my logo. I've turned off the bounding box now, just in the upper left, so that I can actually see it without the box. Helps me get the position. And I'm going to colorize it. I'm just going to change the hue of this logo. So I've gone to the hue and saturation menu. Changing the color just by sliding the hue slider. And I'm also going to play with saturation. Getting close. And say OK. So there's my new color. Let's zoom in a bit. Adjusted the levels a little on it. Increase the contrast. Save the file. All right, now moving on. We're going to come back to the logo a little bit later. So adding a little form around this rear hub. I'm going to add that area right there. I'm just going to put a little blur on that to flare that into the side of that chainstay. Adding a little bit of form, making this guy a little dome shaped. And there's another little fillet and radius wrapping around the center of that crank arm as it comes out. And I just made a quick copy of that, made it a little bit smaller so the one underneath could provide a parting line between that lighter gray shape. Here's my crank arm taking form, a little reflected light, a little light from above. You always want your primary light source to be stronger. So you notice on that crank arm, essentially it's gray. The light source from above is white, so that would give me gray. I'm going to put a little concavity on the side of this crank arm. So I've just made a little path, made a new layer, filled it, and now I've just come back in, having it just catch the light a little bit, and I'm going to now just blur it. So I'm going to do a little Gaussian blur on it, and that effectively makes it have a little softened edge, which looks like a little radius and a little fillet happening. So it's a great way to add little radiuses and fillets is make things with sharp edges first, and then go back and using the Gaussian blur tool, blur those guys, and you get nice little controlled fillets and radiuses. Save the file. All the time starting to look, a little bit more three-dimensional, a little more realistic. And you can see all the rendering I've been doing so far is matte surface, right? I haven't had to worry yet about any reflections, not worrying about trying to make anything shiny. It's just try to make the form read first. So here I've decided I'll make that part of the tube or that part of the bike a little bit wider, make that seat tube a little bit narrower. So I'm making it flare in and show a little bit of a step there out around that orange part of the bike. And now starting to pull out some of the parting lines. So wherever they would catch the light from above. There we go, adding a little part line between those two surfaces. Again, just tightening up this gray section. Little part line there. Now, you could have left that, right? It could have been a perfect seam. Maybe there is no part line. Maybe it's just a paint color change. In that case, you wouldn't want to put in that little radius. But in this case, since it's product rendering and I'm trying to show as many variations in one rendering as I can, we'll throw a little radius on that. Save the file. Yeah, it's getting closer. Zoom back, have a look at it. Since it is sped up a little bit, you don't see me doing that much, but I actually am. When it pulls back, I'm thinking about it, seeing what I like, what I don't like, what can happen next. You see, it's very methodical, very straightforward. Here I'm going to stroke the path of those cables. So size my airbrush right on top of that path, make it black, and stroke the path of those cables. You can readjust their layer order to put them behind the other areas that they should be behind. I'm just going to erase off the end of that cable housing. There we go, clean it up. And now I'm going to render a little cable port for this cable housing to come down and land on the orange part of the bike. Oops, forgot to turn on preserve transparency there. So go ahead and see if I didn't have the preserve transparency button when I started that little cable rendering, it was going to paint everywhere. When I turned it on, of course, it only paints where I have pixels. It's a very, very effective way to retain the edges that you made with your paths. There I am making them overlap a little, lightening them up a bit. So again, it's just a very straightforward, simple airbrush. Again, when I'm doing this sort of product rendering types of things, it's really all it is, just simple fuzzy airbrush after you've made all your edges with paths. A little reflected light from below, a little light from above on the end of that cable housing. Save the file. Got a cable housing down here to add for our brake. There it is. Just stroke that path with a black airbrush. Add a little bit of form to it. Remember, it's a cylinder. It's wrapping around. A little reflected light coming off the fork. Maybe a little hint of some sort of coupling over there. pull up that highlight a little bit on the cable. You can see how you could spend a lot of time on this, but if you're efficient, and keep in mind that it's don't get carried away and trying to do every single detail. Just do the bigger things. Make sure the other stuff is in there. There's a little port for that little arm to come back into the fork. Make sure all this stuff it's in there, but you can really do it all freehand at a certain level. You're really after your big, clean, the big shapes. Make sure those are nice and clean. Add a little core shadow on this guy. Make it look a little metallic, maybe. So that's our little steering arm. Back to the airbrush. There we go. And you'll see it when it's finished, and you'll see in the Photoshop file that I've given you when you open it up, that's it's pretty simple. I'm not really going around trying to reflect, wheels, like that little arm. I didn't go in and do the reflection on the side of the fork. There's so much more detail you could add, but in a lot of cases, it's just going to be wasted time because, if you're doing a dozen of these, only one of them is going to be one that you pursue. So you need to keep them fast, keep them efficient. Let's go back to the paths. Okay, now we're into the reflections. What I've done is just made a new path layer there. And what you have to imagine is where would your line of sight bounce off of the surface of your bike and go up to the ceiling? On my ceiling is essentially this big rectangular light box. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to visualize where my line of sight is going to go over, contact this sections of my bike, and bounce straight up. And wherever that happens, I'm going to put a path. I'm going to block out an area now where I think my line of sight is going to bounce straight up and hit my light source. Now, the best way to learn how to do this is to, one, observe a lot of forms that are similar. So if you had a picture of a bike that already existed, you can match the sort of lighting condition and values. Also, we'll have some more DVDs coming out specifically on reflections and how you can plot these. Here's the light source, and you can see I'm really just blocking it in. I'm not worried about fine tuning at this point. I'm just trying to say, okay, where are they going to go in general? Just like I did early on when I was covering over the marker sketch. And this is going to be the single layer that we add that makes all of these surfaces look like they're, painted a glossy paint. And this will be the only layer that it takes. So we go from matte surface to shiny very quickly. So we've made the new path. Now I need to fine tune it. So you go over to this white arrow to not the direct select path, but the other one. So I can grab the handles independently, move them around. Right, it's my fine-tuning pass before we fill this path layer with white. In this case, it's white because that's the color of my light source. If you had a sort of a magenta color light or greenish light, then you would fill it with that color. But in this case, we're just going to use straight white light. Makes it the simplest. All right, now I've grabbed the black arrow, and I can grab that entire path now, and I can scale it. So in this case, I've done a little copy and paste because I essentially want the same shape on the radius just below it. So now I'm trying to squeeze it, modify it, basically just trying to fine-tune the shape, make sure it's a little bit thinner than the one above. And that's going to really help to define that little radius. Okay, now I've accelerated the speed a little bit again in order to get this done a little quicker under my 2-hour time limit. There we go. Finessing the reflections. The reflections tell a lot about the section of your shapes. So if you're trying to design something that's supposed to be, a very controlled surface like this is very much automotive, styling and surfaces and mainstream consumer product shapes, then go for, very sort of designed and controlled reflections. If I, made choppy little reflections, the surface might look really lumpy. So when you're trying to define a smooth, continuous surface, go for a really long, smooth, continuous reflection. See right there, I'm trying to show that there's a little step there, right? That part of the tube is wider than the seat tube that comes down. One way to do that is to flare out and wrap that little reflection around that section. Here's our fender reflection. It's also the way that I tell the width of the radius, right? As the radius, if you have a light source overhead, there's two radiuses on that fender right there. There's one on the lower part and one on the upper. Obviously, there are very different radiuses in size, so you just scale your reflection appropriately. So this is a smaller radius, a smaller surface, so it gets a smaller reflection. And it tells me that it's pretty constant because the reflection doesn't taper very much. Here, this is going to be a very small radius on the edge of that wheel, so look, a very, very thin reflection. And it has to stop right there because it would reflect the fender at that point. This part we only see a little bit on the left side because it would be reflecting the chainstay above. And in this simplified rendering technique, you don't worry about going in and literally reflecting the fender or the chainstay above. All we do is just stop the white reflection. If you stop the white reflection, your eye will read it that something must be blocking that. The thing that is blocking it is just above. So there's a little radius and fillet right through there, so a little separate reflection for that. A little reflection riding along the radius of the chainstay. Now this is going to make this look very continuous, the form through here, since it overlaps these, the two orange parts and that gray centerpiece. So still fine-tuning. When I first started doing this technique, I used to just sort of, block in these reflections freehand with a big flat, hard-edge brush. And, I always thought, paths, they're too slow, they're tedious, they just take too long to do. But in the end, I started trying to do it with paths, and I actually timed myself. And it was a lot faster to do it with paths. So you'll get the hang of it. They'll be a little bit tedious and laborious at the beginning, but they will give you a superior look to trying to do this perfectly clean, sort of, showroom-esque type of model, right? This is the bike that hasn't been ridden around in the dirt yet. There, I want a little tapering radius there, so I'll make my reflection taper a little bit. There we go. A little tiny radius here, so a little thin reflection. There we are, just fine-tuning our last few reflections. Have the reflection up on... See, I'm pulling the handles there. That changes the speed of that curve. I can make it match the circular curve of the rim. And I stopped that one right there, right? Normally it would go down if our hub assembly wasn't there and our disc brake and fork, it would go right down to the lower part of the wheel. But because it's in the way, it's between the light and us, this one... It's actually a lot between the light and that little guy, but I'm probably going to cheat him in there anyway. It will help to show that form a little. Okay, now I'm going to set a destination layer. There we go, made a new layer. Now I'm going to pick the color of my light source, which is white, and unselect and then reselect that path. There we go. And then hit the fill button. There we are. So now it looks like a big graphic, but we're not quite done yet. So here I got to fine tune this edge a little bit. Didn't quite fill in where I wanted it. Okay, so this is your last chance. Come back in, do a little erasing. Okay, now I just erased out what's basically that cable housing. Now this is where we start to make it look a little bit more realistic. So the handlebars are just above this fender, so they must be between the light source and my fender. So I'm coming in here and I'm erasing that reflection. That basically is all I need to trick my eye into believing that that's a reflection of the handlebars above. I'm come in here, I'm going to erase a little bit of this guy. Of course, I had it overlapping my disc brake. That wouldn't work. So, got a little cleanup left to do here. So pick the white, clean that up first. Now I'm going to erase my cut line. Erase the part line there. That makes it a real physical radius. There we go. Now, if you're getting really technical on it and really trying to make these reflections look great, you can come in and smudge and pull them around with the smudge tool. Save the file. Okay. There we go. Got our bike starting to come into shape. Now, this is the most important part of making this reflection look more realistic, and it's actually erasing a bunch of it. So what you want to do is think of your light source as having a hotspot. Now, you can put that hotspot wherever you want. You could put it in the middle of that light box up above. You could put it to one edge. The thing is, when you erase, you just want to be consistent. So effectively, I'm saying that the middle of my light box, wherever my eye bounces more vertical or straight up, would be the hottest spot. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a gradation to my reflection, because it's really the gradation of a big white light box. So there we are. My light near that elbow is bouncing more straight up than it is out at the end of that fork. So putting a little gradation in these is going to make them look much more subtle, much more realistic. And it doesn't take a lot to trick your eye into believing that that surface is very shiny. Erasing a little more. There we are, leaving just the end of that with a hot spot. See, the horizontal one is a little bit brighter. So wherever those sections go horizontal, I make them shinier. So there we are so far. We've got the reflection layer in there. It's starting to work. I'm going to double it up. It wasn't quite bright enough for me. I erased a little too much. And I'm changing the opacity of that new second reflection layer. If you open up the unflattened Photoshop file that I gave you, you'll be able to see that I left the reflection layer without the erasing. So you can see how that looks as well. You see it's starting to work. You know, it's starting to look three-dimensional. It's starting to look shiny. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of color dodging. Now this is a technique, a quickie technique for trying to make things look metallic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to color dodge towards that orange that I've just chose and changing the size of my airbrush. I'm going to my main tube here, the orange one. And what I'm going to do is say that, well, it's not just glossy paint. The paint actually has a little bit of either, it could have a couple things on top. It could have a little metal flake in it, maybe, or it could have a little orange pearl coat on it. And that would mean wherever it reflects the light, we would get this little orange shift to a brighter orange. So essentially all I have to do is go underneath where my reflections are, because that's the reflection of the light source, and color dodge, which is brightening, and it's brightening towards that color I chose. So I'm starting to get a little color shift in this lower layer. So these are like the last little touches to that layer to try and give it a little bit more of a glow and hint that that paint is a little bit special. And you can see actually I duplicated that layer. If you look down, you'll see in the lower right corner, just below my highlighted blue layer, is the copy of that. So a lot of times if I'm a little unsure, you know, is this going to look just a little too disco or you know, a little cheesy, then I'll, you know, make a quick copy of it so I don't undo all the rendering I did. And then I'll experiment with this color dodge. So again, wherever my reflection of the white light goes, I'm just color dodging and bringing up that orange a little bit. It's effectively just increasing the contrast, which will start to make it look more reflective. And I'm also getting a little bit of a color shift. You can see it's going a little bit more yellow wherever it's reflecting that light. I'm really going to do this area right through here where it's horizontal. I'll zoom back, have a look. That's getting a little more interesting. It's the way I found that is the easiest way in these sort of production renderings to do metallic, is to just go in where it reflects your light source and start stretching that reflection of the light source across and out away from that hard edge that you've erased to or that you did with your path, and let it, because that's what the metal flake would do. The light source would reflect and stretch across the shape. There you go. Just again, right underneath that reflection. So just that main orange part. Am I happy with it? Yeah, it's coming along. It's helping to add a little bit more form. I'm going to increase the size of my brush there, get that whole surface to roll a little bit more up to the light source. Pretty happy with the color dodging now, so I'm going to continue doing it a little bit. Not going to worry about duplicating my layers. There we are, save the layer. Sorry, save the file. Turn it off and on. There you go. You can see the change. I'm getting pretty close. There's not a lot left to do. I don't know that I'm incredibly happy with the color palette yet. Something I may want to revisit. Yeah, let's revisit that now. We're going to take grab a couple areas and start playing a little bit with the color. Again, I've done the rendering. See, it's gray on the bottom. So when I change this color, the gray is not changing. If it was, say, a yellow reflecting from the ground plane, if the ground was yellow, then as I'm changing this color, the yellow would also be changing. So it would no longer match my ground plane. So unless you want to put your reflected light on a separate layer, using gray is a pretty fast and efficient way to get the same result. Okay, here we go. Just modifying that guy a little bit, trying to match back to the front fork. Yeah, I've got to separate those two, right? I just picked that disc and it was attached to the bottom bracket. So I've just made a new layer by cutting it and selecting it. There we go. Now they're the same color and the same value. I think I like that a little bit better. Let's play with the seat tube. Not incredibly happy with the seat tube. Let's make it a color. Gray was disappearing into the background. Again, see, even at the very end here, it's not too late. Here I'm adjusting levels. So see, I'm able to move the mid-tone there with this button, and I'm able to move the shadows independently. A little bit undecided on what I want to do with the seat tube now. Let's try darkening the entire thing first, then increasing the contrast a little. Yeah, maybe that'll work. I held down the Option key there. Option Command L gave me the same level setting for the lower part of the tube. Here, adjusting. I colorized this one. It was just gray before, so added some color to it. Try to make it match the fender. Looks sort of like now it's a continuous material. Let's play with the wheels. The wheels are definitely getting a little bit lost with the fenders. Playing with the hue and the saturation again. Now, if you do this too much, your gradations are going to start to separate, especially if you start playing with levels a lot. But you can do a little bit of it. Color usually isn't too bad, but when you start playing with saturation a lot like I did on that one, you can really start to separate and lose the subtleties of your gradations. So if that happens, you might have to do a little re-render. But that's all right. You know, if it means that the design looks better, then it's worth it. You know, it's whatever it takes to make your ideas look the best they can. Here's our top tube. I'm going to play around with the color and value of that. Again, held down the Option key, went Option Command U. That gave me the same settings. That's getting a little bit closer. I think I like that a little bit better. It's definitely popping off of our background a little bit stronger than it was. I'll play with the forks. I'm sorry, not the forks, the fenders. There's the fenders. Do I like that? Maybe not. Maybe not. Command Z, it's always great for that. Get rid of the tools, have a look. Say, turn them off and on, see if you like that. Now what I've done here is that I've lost a little bit of the gray, which is unfortunate. So you either can go back in and literally just paint it right back on top. Basically, what I did right there was I unsaturated that area, trying to make it look gray. That's not very effective. So now I'm going to go back in and just literally grab my airbrush and paint it. Here, you see me over on the right-hand side. I just made a little parent layer there, a little child parent layer. If you hold down the Shift key when you get a little icon showing up between layers, what it does is that it makes a new layer on top, and it only allows me to paint where I already have pixels below. It's a lot like Preserve Transparency, but there's nothing on that layer. So it looks at the layer below it in order to see where it allows me to paint. In this case, I'm just painting right on the wheels. There you go, a little more gray, a little more reflected light. And as I add in that ground color, right, it starts to make them look a little bit more reflective as well, as opposed to being so matte. So it starts to work just like the reflection of the white light above. Save the file. All right, going back to a little bit of color dodge here. Here I've decided to save a tool preset since I'm using this so much. So I've saved a color dodge airbrush, which is now part of my tool presets. And now I'm color dodging this fork. There's a little housing out to that arm. And I'm color dodging it to red. So as you'll see this, it starts to increase the contrast. It's taking it from being like a glossy, painted surface to being more metallic. So I'm sort of effectively looks like it's adding a little metal flake to the surface, stretching those reflective highlights all across the surface. There we are. Wherever I have a reflection of my light source above, right there, catch a little bit of light. Same through here is a nice little radius just below the edge of that saddle. I'm going to merge those two together. There we go. Come back in. Hit a little color dodge on there. Really starting to get that stay to glow a little bit. I'm going to do the same on my wheels. It tells me they're the same painted material. And I'm leaving some areas, more matte, basically, or non-metallic, like the blue fenders there. And I want that material change. It's all about the contrast in those materials next to each other. If we've got this metallic red, there we go. It's looking pretty good. And there's always little things you could do. I mean, you can keep chasing these, refining the reflections, refining the highlights. This guy needs a little bit of love on there. There we go. Make that a little reflective. Make it look a little more metallic. I'm going to merge those two guys together. There we go. So merge those layers so I can work them now together. There we are. Little reflective highlights added. A little more reflected light. Again, look out to the right. You'll see on my layer menu, you see all of those locks on the right-hand side. It's all of those lock transparency locks so that it preserves all my edges. Adding a little more reflected light, making it look even shinier. So getting a bit more of our environment put in here. It's a really unresolved part of this design is that right where I'm painting right now is this fender and back of this tube. It's really just unrefined. It's just an attempt to make it all disappear at this point. Really didn't spend much time figuring out what I wanted to do back in there. So basically trying to make that seam between that orange and that blue just disappear by darkening it into shadow. It's those little tricks that you will never get out of a 3D render. You can selectively go in and hide areas that you aren't as happy with. But when you have a 3D render, of course, you never get any of that. So in a lot of ways, Photoshop I prefer because you can go in and draw attention to the most attractive areas of your design. There's a nice, put on a little cable housing. Can't forget the little functional bits. Back to that brake caliper. There's a little nice reflected light that's red coming off of our stay. Yeah, let's put a little housing, some way for that to get back into the chainstay there. There's probably not a chain on this bike, but it's a stay anyway for the rear wheel. All right, getting pretty close. We're sort of nearing the end of this one. All right, now I'm going to burn down a couple little areas, just trying to get a little bit more contrast popping here. It wasn't, it looked very flat right through there. Up in the even though it's in the shadow area, I can always make that curve a little bit more by adding a little bit of value, right? Value change equals form change. So I'm adding a little value as it wraps around underneath there, making it look a little more cylindrical. Save it again. Now I'm going to add a little bit of form. Let's deboss this logo into the surface of this bike. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can go into layer styles, play around with these buttons. You can emboss it here, making it bump out. In this case, I think I'm just going to go ahead and do a straight up render on it. But I fully encourage you to take advantage of the strengths of Photoshop in these layer styles. They work great for buttons, great for parting lines, things like that. So the best way to do that, and the only way I've sort of self-taught in Photoshop, and there's always like 3 or 4 ways to do something in Photoshop, is just you have to just find some time to go in, either get a good book or experiment with these. What I'm going to do is just make a copy of this logo layer and put it underneath and paint it out. So I hit preserve transparency, painted it out. I'm going to blur it a little bit, and that'll give me a little blurry edge. So I made it orange first so I could see the edge. There's the edge. So effectively I'm adding a little radius right around this. I'm going to hit preserve transparency. And now I'm just going to come back in and render the areas that would catch light with the orange that I've got surrounding this. So you can see I'm just quickly hitting the option key, color picking from around it, the shadow areas and the light areas. So this guy's supposed to be slightly inset into the surface. So putting a little darkening across all the horizontal radiuses and the verticals, across the top of each letter and across the bottom of each letter, right, or each shape. I'll run a little brighter orange. There we go. It's about all that needs. But again, being clever and having a strategy for how you organize your layers can really save you when, one, your client doesn't like the colors, or two, you want to make changes. Adding some part lines here. So I'm just darkening the radiuses. Lightening up a little radius there. There we go, right when they hit each other. Let it fade as it rolls away from the light source. Okay. Generally, last look across everything starting to come together. Okay. Now, if you want to put a logo on something, here I'm going to just scribble, like, say it's our famous future cyclist signature. It's beautiful. So I just grabbed a lasso tool, scribbled on there, and said make new layer via copy. And now I'm adjusting the levels. So I'm going to lighten that area. And now I'm going to go in and change the color of it. There we go. Let's not lighten it first. Let's just change color. So I've just selected an area. You can see it still wraps across the surface. And all I'm doing is sliding the hue slider. And there we go. I'm changing saturation of it a little bit on the lighter side. There we go. And now it looks like a decal that's going directly underneath my reflective highlight, or my reflection, I should say. Right? And so it wraps across the surface because it retains all of the value work that we had done. Yeah, let's do it again. You can see it. There we go. I've just selected an area off the fender. Hit, do the same on the front. Hit layer, new layer via copy, and then go in and change the color. So it's just another layer stacked on top. So I put these little orange tips on the fenders. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to erase. And just erasing that edge, and that's the way I can change that graphic. In this case, it's not a part line, it's not a seam, so I don't have to render a radius there. It's just like it's painted, so it's perfectly smooth. And by seeing that reflective line over the top, it retains it and makes it look very smooth. Now, there are always areas you can go back and revisit. Like, of course, I didn't really detail up inside that front hub. Could always make that better. And you could add more to your cast shadow. You could add, you sharpen it up. You could add the width. You could start putting in more perspective. You could put in the far side of the forks, far side of the rear stay, unless there's only one. But that's all stuff that would just add more and more time. But to be an effective, fast, efficient rendering, I think that, it's about all you need to do. We're getting pretty close. I'm going to move some things around here. We're going to make a border. This is also another thing I like to do. It's a way to trick the human eye. A lot of people have seen those 4x5 transparency borders. And so if I'm trying to make this look photoreal, if I can also put a little border on it so that it tricks the eye into thinking it's, maybe it's a 4x5 or something. Obviously people know it's not because it's not a real bike. But if you can just trick them into thinking immediately that there's something that is familiar, that looks photographic, they'll think it's more real than it really is. So put a little layer up on the top, put a border on it, right on top of everything else. Now, the border is the place I like to throw in the text. So here I'm going to put in some text. This is the DVD bike demo. So there I've dropped a new text layer on, change your sizing, change your spacing, change the color if you need to. There we go. Change the size, change the placement a little. Don't forget to sign it and date it. So here I'm signing it. I'm going to drop that into the lower right corner. Put a little copyright on it. And change the color. So I hit preserve transparency, just paint it over the top of it. I'm just doing a sort of a light gray on that black border. Add the date. There we go. Change the date. It's done at the end of November. Position it. Zoom back out. See if you like it. Yeah, it's subtle enough. Has a title, has a date, tells somebody who did it. And that's basically, we're almost done on this one. Looking pretty real. Parts look shiny that I want to look shiny. Parts look metallic where I want them to look metallic. Couple little things we could do. We haven't really done much in the way of textures at all. Everything has been straight up painted. Let's look at applying a texture to this saddle. So I've isolated that saddle, done a new layer via cut. So it used to be on the handlebar layer. And here we are, texture, and I'm going to go to the texturizer. And this is sort of a fast freebie way of getting some pebbly texture onto some of your different materials. So I'm going to center the saddle in my preview window. And I'm going to go over to sandstone. And I'm going to leave it as top lighting, because that's what I'm doing. And I'm going to play now with the scaling of that texture. There we go. You can see it changing in the preview window. Change how coarse or how large that texture is. Looks pretty good. Okay. I'm going to go to preserve transparency. We'll change the contrast a little. A lot of times when you add texture, your form disappears a little. So a lot of times they increase the contrast back a little. In fact, I'm going to burn it here a little. Looks like, yeah, just right through here, little bottom edge. Now remember, when you dodge and burn, you won't lose your texture. So in a way, this is a nice, after I've added the texture, the only way I can add more form back to it is if I dodge and burn it. If I paint it over that, it will start to look, smooth again. So there, I've shown that radius a little bit stronger. Now let's pull, let's say if we want to add a graphic on there. Let's say that saddle had some little logo on it. I'm going to make a little path. I'm going to change its shape here a little bit. So if I want to do a little logo that wraps on that textured surface, I made it a selection, made a new layer by copying it, and now I'm just going to change the color and the value. So I've made it orange by colorizing it. There we go. So if you had a little logo wrapping on that texture, that's what it would look like. Change the levels a little. Almost done. I can see I got a couple little areas I've missed here. That's really blending with our background. That little elbow there. So I'm going to paint that out. Yep. There we go. That's effectively one bike rendering done. It's at a point now where I would show it to a client. A lot of, especially on the bikes, they're so two-dimensional. This is really the first thing I show to clients. And it's really because bikes are so sensitive with the tube thicknesses and things like that. This would be something I would do, obviously not as a production bike, at least this design, but more as a sci-fi or a movie bike. But pretty happy with it, especially for the amount of time it's taken. I mean, in one long afternoon, you can get this done. Here I'm going to play with the background a little. So pulled up the levels, and since my background's on a separate layer, you can experiment with making the bike, the silhouette of the bike, pop a little more, right, or a little less. So it's really great having this layers set up this way. See, if I make it very, very light, then we really see the silhouette much more than the interior shapes. It becomes a very, very strong graphic. And of course, everything looks darker because of the surrounding value. You play with your mid value, and then now my light area is going to start to pop a bit more, and now we're going to see the inside shapes a little bit more. Actually pretty happy with about where it was. But you can see how easy it is to change the values. And of course, you can do all those great fun Photoshop things to it. You could change the color. But if you start changing the color, remember that if your ground plane changes, all your reflected light color needs to change. So, if you're going to add color to this one, I might only add it up, in the upper half of the rendering of the background. All right. That finishes off our bike rendering from scratch in Photoshop. I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm going to show you one more rendering. And what we're going to talk about is how to throw some adjustment layers on top of this to improve your print quality. But those are basically all the steps I do for the simple industrial design sort of draft view technical rendering. Not very gestural, not very artistic, but really, the main goal is showing an audience and showing the rest of a development team what the design might look like if it were to be built. And it's always a great thing to do these, before you hit doing even a 3D model, because they're significantly faster. All right, we're going to move into a bicycle that I did for the first concept design book. And what I want to show you is that we scroll down to layer, we go to new layer, we go to new adjustment layer, and levels. And if you're having problems with printing, you can drop a new adjustment layer on top of an existing rendering, and it will affect everything below it without changing your original painting or your original rendering. Now, this is a bike that's obviously got a bit more time put into it, but not that much more. I think this was probably only about 13 or 14 hours of rendering time. And it's a bit more illustrative. And you can do this adjustment layer thing with lots of different things, like color balance. So here I've pulled a color balance layer, and I'm going to affect the highlights. So I've clicked on the highlight layer, and I want to make my highlights a little bit more red, a little bit more yellow. So I pull the sliders for the highlights. Here's for the midtones. I want a little more red in my midtones, a little more yellow. And what I'm doing is that I'm, because this might be printer specific, you might only be having trouble with one printer. So you don't want to necessarily go and modify your entire painting and save it that way. So these are great things to just drop right on top. Here I'm going to change the saturation of the entire piece. So I'm making it much more saturated. This originally was CMYK, so here we're RGB, so I can make it more saturated and the color will hold together. Let's zoom in, see some of the details. So in this one, you can see much more defined cast shadows. There's a very defined cast shadow. Same down below. And this one obviously took me a little bit longer, but it's all the same steps with the exception of these stronger cast shadows. You can see there's the reflected light. In this case, the ground is yellow. So underneath, right, I've got to have all this yellow to make this work. So rendering in details, cut lines. This one's got a little suspension on it. All the reflections, all the reflected light from our ground plane. Much more defined shadow. There you can see that fork. You definitely see it in the cast shadow there, that sort of baseball diamond shaped fork. But I would really, suggest that you use these adjustment layers to tweak your design. Not to tweak your design, tweak your values and your color for printing without, totally screwing up your original rendering. That takes us to the end of our 2 hours. And I hope you enjoyed this rendering demo. You find it useful, and it helps your designs look better than they did before.
Gnomon Workshop.